Hello, this is Professor Harper again, and we're going to be talking about broadcasting. I spent 15 years in broadcasting for ABC News and ABC 2020. Before that, I worked for about 10 years in print. So I was able to see the difference in terms of the standards between print journalism and broadcast journalism. In terms of regulatory history concerning broadcasting, the U.S. Constitution obviously said nothing about broadcasting because it didn't exist. So, the real issue in terms of constitutional law was, how does broadcasting fit under the First Amendment? What type of administrative law, statutes had to deal with broadcasting? And there have been a number. So, the Wireless Ship Act of 1910 required that large ships have wireless with operators. And one of the things that happened is that wireless signals created interference because of the limited broadcasting bands in the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's called scarcity of spectrum, and it's one thing that has had to be dealt with until about the 1970s, when cable became a dominant purveyor, and there was no real problem with respect to the airwaves for television, but there still are problems with respect to radio interference. The Radio Act of 1912, which came as a result of the Titanic disaster, gave the Secretary of Commerce the power to grant licenses, and many major communications companies bought the licenses. But this act failed to limit the frequencies and the power of the transmission. So if you were operating from, let's say, AM 880 in Philadelphia at 50,000 watts, and somebody was operating at AM 880 on the dial with 100,000 watts, you would have interference. And sometimes you'll still see that today. The Radio Act of 1927 gave the U.S. government, through the Federal Radio Commission, and keep in mind that the television really didn't come into play until after World War II, it gave the FRC the power to regulate radio. And it established here the principle of limited spectrum or scarcity of spectrum, and also that the airwaves specifically belonged to the public. The Communications Act of 1934 was a big step forward, or a big step for regulation of radio and later television and a variety of other things. It established the Federal Communications Commission, which still governs radio and television, but the FCC has also expanded now to cover satellites, cellular telephones, cable television, and a variety of other things. It's a big, big agency. So what's the difference between print versus broadcast? You have the issue of scarcity of spectrum, but it's odd that that's no longer an issue with respect to television. You also have the issue of prior restraint, which has been used far more frequently in broadcasting than it has in print. And to a certain extent, broadcast entities are treated differently and defined differently from print, primarily because the government gives you a license to broadcast, and the government can take away that license, where there are no licenses when it comes to print. The case law, there's quite a bit of case law. 1932, the Trinity Methodist Church versus the Federal Radio Commission, and what this was is that the federal, it dealt with the issue of licenses. So the Federal Appeals Court upheld the denial of a radio license to Reverend Robert Schuller because of his attacks on government, labor leaders, and other religions. 1 year earlier, in Neer versus Minnesota, as you may recall, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a newspaper's right to do exactly what Schuller did. In 1969, Red Lion Broadcasting versus the FCC, the court held that the First Amendment does not prohibit a broadcaster from being forced to carry specific programming. And this went to the issue of what's called the fairness doctrine. If there was a story about me, you had to provide me with the same amount of time to respond. The fairness doctrine has since been removed, but in 1974, the court held in the Miami Herald Publishing versus Tornillo that a newspaper could not be forced to publish specific material. So you see the difference between broadcasters and print. In 1987, the FCC rescinded the fairness doctrine, although many public interest groups are still trying to reinstate it. In 1978, in the FCC versus Pacifica, the comedian George Carlin specifically used what are called the 7 dirty words, and I'm sure you can take a guess at what most of them are. And a child inadvertently heard what became legally known as indecent language on the car radio. And the court found that because broadcasting was so pervasive, that it required more regulation and supervision than other media. The FCC is an independent agency, such as the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and others. There are 5 commissioners with technically no political affiliation, but in essence what it comes down to is that there are, depending upon who's in power, there are generally 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and then the chairman is generally from the party in power, be it the Democrats or the Republicans. And the FCC has executive powers to supervise things. They can pass laws in a legislative standpoint, and they also have the ability to be the first court in which rulings are made. In 1996, the Telecommunications Act was the most significant overhaul of the broadcasting area since 1934. It changed ownership rules to allow a greater concentration of ownership. It also attempted unsuccessfully to regulate pornography on the internet. It rescinded national ownership restrictions on radio. It expanded the number of televisions owned by radio stations. It expanded the number of television stations owned nationally and locally. It also allowed expanded cross-ownership of all media, including newspapers, radio, television, cable outlets. So it really allowed for more concentration of power into fewer sources. The Communications Decency Act was part of it, and the aim was to protect those under the age of 18 from being exposed to indecent and obscene material on the internet. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the internet does not use limited public spectrum, and that people are not as likely to be exposed inadvertently to sexually explicit materials. You actually had to go there, rather than with the indecent language of George Carlin. It couldn't just come at you over the radio spectrum. Obscenity and indecency, I'm really not going to cover very much, but they are legal terms that are different from pornography. If you're interested, it's in Chapter 5. But again, the internet here in this decision, actually another medium, has more legal protection than broadcasting does. Section 315 of the communications law said that all broadcast outlets must accept political advertising, and the cost of that advertising must be at the most favored rate. The broadcast outlet may not edit the advertisement, but the material can be rejected for failure to meet technical standards. And the outlets do have defamation protection if a candidate attacks someone and calls someone a crook. So there is some additional protection there. Digital television, which we all now have for the most part, started out in 1996 at the same time, and that was when the FCC adopted a transition from analog to digital television. It allowed for a 10-year transition, but then later was moved to 1909, as long as 85% of the consumers have the ability to receive digital. It allowed for the retention of analogs, but what was really key here is that an analog signal takes up much more room on the spectrum than a digital signal. So it allowed stations that had a license, let's say in New York with WABC, it actually created 4 different digital signals from that one analog signal without any significant payment to the government. Broadcast journalists have similar protections for defamation under the First Amendment. It's usually handled as libel, but it can be construed as slander or oral statements, generally not the case. There is greater difficulty, particularly with respect to privacy, particularly with respect to false light privacy, because of the images that can be shown. It's something that we'll talk about in Chapter 14. There's greater difficulty with respect to intellectual property with news programs outside of the conventional broadcast times, such as 2020 and Dateline. Those are technically not news programs, but entertainment programs, because they're in what are called the prime time of television. 60 Minutes is the same thing. So that's a brief overview of broadcast. We will talk about cable television in a later lecture, but thank you very much, and we'll see you online.